Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are going to be reading a story this evening from Arthur Rackham's fairy book. The book the story that I've chosen this evening is called Hop of My Thumb. It involves a small boy, an ogre, and the Seven League Boots, which, if you're unfamiliar, they're said to grant people the ability to leap vast distances with a single bound. The Seven League Boots show up in several different stories throughout folklore, mostly Germanic folklore, but I think I've seen it in other places as well. So, a little bit of trivia there, and an interesting relic that shows up in various stories. So, Hop of My Thumb. There once lived in a village a faggot maker. All right, I feel the need to specify that in this context, they're talking about somebody that bundles together twigs used for kindling. The old British version, the word faggot means bundle of twigs used for kindling. And I'm trying to think of a good translation here. Woodcutter wouldn't be quite right because he's not chopping wood. He's collecting twigs and tying them together. All right. There once lived in a village a man and his wife who had 7 children, all boys, the eldest no more than 10 years old, and the youngest only 7. It was odd enough to be sure that they should have so many children in such a short time, but the truth is the wife usually brought 2 or 3 at a time. This made them very poor, for not one of the boys was old enough to make a living. And what was still worse, the youngest was a puny little fellow who hardly ever spoke a word. Now this indeed was a mark of his good sense, but it made his mother and father suppose him to be silly, and they thought that at last he would turn out to be a fool. This boy was the smallest ever seen, for when he was born he was no bigger than a man's thumb, which made him to be christened by the name Hop of My Thumb. The poor child was the drudge of the whole house, and always bore the blame of everything that was done wrong. For all this, Hop of My Thumb was far more clever than any of his brothers, and though he spoke but little, he heard and knew more than people thought. It happened just at this time that for want of rain the fields had grown but half as much corn and potatoes as they used to grow, so that the man and his wife could not give the boys the food they had before, which was always either bread or potatoes. After the father and mother had grieved some time, they thought, as they could contrive no other way to live, they must get rid of their children. One night, when the boys had gone off to bed, the father and his wife were sitting over a few lighted sticks to warm themselves. The husband sighed deeply and said, "You see, my dear, we cannot maintain our children any longer, and to see them die of hunger before my eyes I cannot bear. Therefore, tomorrow morning I will take them into the forest and leave them in the thickest part of it, so that they will not be able to find their way back. This will be very easy, for while they amuse themselves, tying up twigs and branches, we need only slip away when they are looking off somewhere." "Ah, husband," cried the poor wife, "you surely can never consent to be the death of your own children." The husband and maid told her to think how very poor they were. The wife replied that if she was poor, she was still their mother, and then she cried as if her heart would break. At last she thought how shocking it would be to see them starve to death before their eyes. So she agreed to what her husband said, and they went sobbing to bed. Hop of My Thumb had been awake all the time, and when he heard his father talk very seriously, he slipped away from his brother's side and crept under his father's bed to hear all that was being said without being seen. When his father and mother had left off talking, he got back to his own bed and passed the night in thinking what he should do the next morning. He rose early and ran to the river's side, where he filled his pockets with small white pebbles, and then went back home. In the morning they all set out, as their father and mother had arranged, and Hop of My Thumb did not say a word to any of his brothers about what he had heard. They came to a forest that was so very thick that they could not see each other a few yards off. The man set to work cutting down wood, and the children began to gather twigs to make faggots of them. When the father and mother saw the young ones were all very busy, they slept away without being seen. The children soon found themselves alone and began to cry as loud as they could. Hop of My Thumb let them cry on, for he knew well enough how to lead them safe home, as he had taken care to drop the white pebbles he had in his pocket along the way he had come. He only said to them, "Never mind, my lads. Mother and father have left us here by ourselves, but follow me, and I will lead you back again." When they heard this, they left off crying and followed Hop o' My Thumb, who soon brought them to their father's house by the very same path they had come along. At first, they had not the courage to go in, but stood at the door to hear what their parents were talking about. Just as the father and mother had come home without their children, a great gentleman of the village sent to pay them 2 guineas for work they had done for him, which he had owed them so long that they had given up all hopes of ever getting a farthing of it. This money made them quite happy, for the poor creatures were very hungry, and had no other way of getting anything to eat. The man and his wife sent his wife immediately to go buy some meat, and as it was a long time since she had made a hearty meal, she bought as much meat as would have been enough for 6 or 8 persons. The truth was, when she was thinking what would be enough for dinner, she forgot that her children were not at home. As soon as she and her husband had done eating, she cried out, "Alas, where are our poor children? How they would feast on what we have left. It was all your fault, husband. I told you we should repent leaving them to starve in the forest. Perhaps they've already been eaten by the hungry wolves." The poor woman shed many tears. "Alas, alas," she said, over and over again. "What has become of my dear children?" The children, who were all at the door, cried together, "Here we are, mother, here we are." She flew like lightning to them, and kissed every one of them. The man and his wife were charmed at having their children once more with them, and their joy lasted till their money was all spent, when they found themselves quite as badly off as they were before. So by degrees they again thought of leaving them in the forest, and that the young ones might not come back a second time, they said they would take them a great deal farther than they had the first. They could not talk about this matter so secretly, but Hop o' My Thumb found means to hear all that passed between them. But he cared very little about it, for he thought it would be easy for him to do just the same as he had before. But though he got up very early the next morning to go to the river to get pebbles, a thing which he had not thought of hindered him, for he found that the house door was double locked. Hop o' My Thumb was out quite a loss what to do. Soon after, his mother gave each of the children a piece of bread for breakfast, and it came into his head that he could make his share do as well as the pebbles, by dropping crumbs of it all the way he went. So he did not eat his piece, but put it into his pocket. It was not long before they all set out, and their parents took care to lead them into the thickest, darkest part of the forest. When they slipped away by a bypath as before, and left the children by themselves again, all this did not give Hop o' My Thumb any concern, for he thought himself quite sure of getting back by means of the crumbs that he had dropped along the way. But when he came back to look for them, not a crumb was left, for the birds had eaten them all up. The poor children were now sadly off, for the farther they went, the harder it was for them to get out of the forest. At last night came on, and the noise of the wind among the trees seemed to them like the howling of wolves, so that every moment they thought they would be eaten up. They hardly dared to speak a word, or to move a limb for fear. Soon after came a heavy rain, which wetted them down to the bone, and made the ground so slippery that they fell down at almost every step, and were dirty and muddy all over. Before it was quite dark, Hop o' My Thumb climbed up to the top of a tree, and looked around on all sides to see if he could find any way of getting help. He saw a small light like that of a candle, but it was a very great way off, and beyond the forest. He then came down from the tree to find the way to do it, but he could not see it when he was on the ground, and he was in the utmost trouble what to do next. They walked on towards the place where he had seen the light, and at last reached the end of the forest, and got sight of it again. They now walked faster, after being much tired and vexed, for every time they got into lower ground they lost sight of the light. They came to the house that it was in. They knocked at the door, which was opened by a very good-natured looking lady, who asked what brought them there. Hop o' My Thumb told them they were poor children who had lost their way in the forest, and begged that she would give them a bed till morning. When the lady saw they had such kind faces, she began to shed tears and said, "Oh, my poor children, you do not know what you have come to. This is the house of an ogre, who eats up little boys and girls." "Alas, madam," replied Hop o' My Thumb, who trembled from head to foot. What shall we do? If we go back to the forest, we are sure to be eaten by the wolves. We would rather, therefore, be eaten by the gentleman. Besides, when he sees us, perhaps he may take pity and spare us. The ogre's wife thought she could contrive to hide them from her husband until morning. So she let them go in and warm themselves by a good fire, for which there was a whole sheep roasting for the ogre's supper. When they had stood a short time by the fire, there came a loud knocking at the door. This was the ogre come home. His wife hurried the children under the bed and told them to lie still, and she let her husband in. The ogre asked if supper were ready, and if the wine were fetched from the cellar. And then he sat down at the table. The sheep was not quite done, but he liked it much better half raw. In a minute or two, the ogre began to sniff, saying that something smelled like child's flesh. It must be this calf which has just been killed, said his wife. I smell child's flesh, I tell thee once more, cried the ogre, looking all about the room. I smell children. There was something going on that I do not know of. As soon as he had spoken these words, he rose from his chair and went towards the bed. Ah, madam, said he, you thought to cheat me, did you? Wretch, thou art old and tough thyself, or else I would eat thee up too. But come, this is lucky enough, for the brats will make a nice dish for 3 friends who are to dine with me tomorrow. Then he drew the children out one by one from under the bed. They fell on their knees and begged his pardon as humbly as they could. But this ogre was most cruel, even by ogre standards. And instead of feeling any pity, he only began to think of how sweet and tender they would be. So he told his wife they would make nice morsels. She served them up with plenty of sauce. He then fetched a large knife and began to sharpen it on a long whetstone that he held in his hand. All the while, he came nearer and nearer to the bed. The ogre took up one of the children, was getting ready to cut him to pieces, when his wife said to him, What in the world makes you take the trouble of killing them tonight? Will it not be time enough tomorrow morning? Hold your prating, replied the ogre. They will grow tender by being kept a little while after they are killed. But, said his wife, you have got so much meat in the house already. There's a calf, 2 sheep, and half a pig. True, said the ogre. So give them all a good supper, so that they may not get lean, and send them to bed. The good creature was glad of this. She gave them plenty for their supper, but the poor children were so terrified they could not eat a bit. The ogre had sat down to drink, very much pleased with the thought of giving his friends such a dainty dish. This made him drink rather more than common, and he was soon obliged to go to bed himself. Now, the ogre had 7 daughters, who were all very young, like Hop o' My Thumb and his brothers. These young ogresses had fair skins because they fed on raw meat like their father, but they had small gray eyes, quite round and sunk in their heads, hooked noses, wide mouths, and very long, sharp teeth, standing a great way off from each other. They were too young as yet to do much mischief, but they showed that if they lived to be as old as their father, they would be quite as cruel as he was. They took pleasure already in biting young children. The ogresses had been put to bed very early that night. They were all in one bed, which was very large, and every one of them had a crown of gold on her head. There was another bed of the same size in the room, and in this the ogre's wife put the 7 little boys, and then went to bed herself along with her husband. Now, Hop o' My Thumb was afraid that the ogre would wake in the night and set to eat him and his brothers while they slept, so got out of the bed in the middle of the night, as softly as he could, took off all his brothers' nightcaps and his own, and crept with them to the bed the ogre's daughters were in. Then he took off the crowns, put the nightcaps on their heads instead. Next, he put the crowns on his brother's head and his own, and he got into bed again. He expected after this that the ogre should come, he should take him and his brothers for his own children. Everything turned out as he wished. The ogre waked soon after midnight, and began to be very sorry that he had put off killing the boys till morning. So he jumped out of bed and took hold of his large knife. Let us see, said he, what the young rogues are about, and do this business at once. Then he walked softly to the room where they all slept, and went up to the bed the boys were in. who were all asleep except Hop o' My Thumb. He touched their heads one at a time, feeling the crowns of gold. He said to himself, "Oh, I nearly made a terrible mistake. I must have drunk too much wine last night." He went next to the bed of his own little ogresses were in, and then he felt the nightcaps. He said, "Ah, here you are, my lads." And in a moment, he had slain all of his daughters. He was very much pleased when he had done this, and went back to his own bed. As soon as Hop o' My Thumb heard him snore, he woke his brothers, and told them to put on their clothes and follow him quickly. They stole down softly into the garden, and then jumped from the wall into the road. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them, but they were so much afraid all the while that they hardly knew which way to take. When the ogre woke in the morning, he said to his wife, grinning, "My dear, go and dress the young rogues I saw last night." The wife was quite surprised at hearing her husband speak so kindly, and did not dream of the real meaning of his words. She supposed he wanted her to help him put on their clothes, so she went upstairs, and the first thing she saw was their 7 daughters laying dead and blood all over. This threw her into a fainting fit. The ogre was afraid his wife might be too long in doing what he had set her about, so he went himself to help her. But as he was as shocked as she had been at the dreadful sight of his children. "Wow, what have I done?" he cried. "But the little rascals shall pay for it. I warrant them." The ogre then put on these boots and set out with all speed. He strode over many parts of the country and at last turned into the very road on which the children were. But they set off toward the faggot-maker's cottage, which they had almost reached. They watched the ogre stepping from mountain to mountain at one step and crossing rivers as if they had been tiny brooks. At this, Hop o' My Thumb thought a little as to what to be done, and spying a hollow place under a large rock, he made his brothers get into it. He then crept in himself, but kept his eye fixed on the ogre to see what he would do next. 7-league boots are very tiresome to the person who wears them, so the ogre now began to think of resting, and happened to sit down on the very rock where the poor children were hid. He was so tired, and it was a very hot day, that he fell asleep, and soon began to snore so loudly that the little fellows were terrified. When Hop o' My Thumb saw this, he said to his brother, "Courage, my lads, never fear. You have nothing to do but to steal away and get home while the ogre is fast asleep, and leave me to shift for myself." The brothers were now very glad to do whatever he told them, and so they soon came to their father's house. In the meantime, Hop o' My Thumb went up to the ogre softly, pulled off his 7-league boots very gently, and put them on his own legs. For though the boots were very large yet, being fairy boots, they could make themselves small enough to fit any leg they pleased. He then went off as fast as the boots would take him to the ogre's house again, where he found his wife crying bitterly for the loss of her murdered daughters. Hop o' My Thumb then told the ogre's wife a long tale which he had invented, that the ogre had been taken by a gang of thieves, who had sworn to kill him if he didn't give them all his gold and silver. The good woman was sadly frightened, and was easily persuaded to hand over to him all she had, so that he might take it and ransom for the ogre. For this ogre, you must know, was a very good husband, though he used to eat up little children. Hop o' My Thumb, having thus got all the ogre's money, came home to his father's house, where he was received with great joy.